Hi, Rod Driver. Happy New Year.
Hi, Jason. Happy New Year to you too.
Welcome back to the first 10 by 6 of 2002. Carrying on the whole run of analysis and evaluation of how society really works. And this week, we're going to focus on how people become excessively wealthy and the damage that it does more holistically to society. But what you also do in these lectures, in this particular lecture, is you're going to kill off that ghost once and for all with the belief that these billionaires have become wealthy from entrepreneurialism and their own intellect. And you're going to identify actually the really key factors that have led to this. So over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much. That's a great introduction. So there are quite a lot of myths about rich people and about wealth in general, and a lot of things that the mainstream media never discusses. So we're going to talk a little bit about how rich people get much richer, but also we're going to talk about the harms that rich people do to society. It's been very interesting. If you read the American press, occasionally you will notice these days that one or two writers are using the expression excessive wealth disorder. They are starting to realize that having people around with many, many billions of dollars in this case is actually causing harm to society. We'll talk about that. So what we're looking at is very, very wealthy people. So for example, the top 25 hedge fund managers, so these kind of financial hedge funds, they each earn approximately $800 million per year. Now, most people think that most rich people become rich because they are entrepreneurs. But in fact, there's been a great deal of research looking at how people become wealthy. And the exact figure varies, but it's between about 2 and 4% of people who are very rich actually get rich through entrepreneurship. The rest get rich by other mechanisms. And we're going to talk about those for the first part of the presentation today. So the general sort of principle to understand, and we talked about this a bit in a previous session about how the economy is rigged so that very big companies can concentrate wealth into their pockets and they make excessive profits, is the economy is rigged for those who already have wealth. If you're born into the right families, go to the right schools, universities, and so on, you will have many opportunities laid out on a plate before you all of your life, because you'll have made all sorts of connections in terms of family connections, political connections, business connections, and so on. And then there is a combination of gambling, luck, ruthlessness, criminality, cheating, and a little bit of talent and hard work that enables people to take advantage of these opportunities that are laid out before them. And very much, it's often about being in the right place at the right time. So we're going to talk a bit about how the system is rigged. So I've used the expression in the past, free lunches. This is where people get money that they have not earned. The most obvious free lunch in relation to individuals is inheritance. Now, there are sometimes discussions in the mainstream media about the extent to which individuals should be entitled to their inheritance, but there is rarely a discussion about how that vast wealth that's being handed down was achieved in the first place. And if you look at the large landowners, property owners, and so on, you actually have to go back through the last few hundred years of history to realize that many people achieved that wealth, or many families achieved that wealth, by doing either unethical or criminal things in the first place. The most obvious of those would be slavery, and then getting compensation from the government when slavery ended. But it also includes things like what people would call the enclosure of the commons. So a long time ago, vast amounts of land were shared by everyone, and a handful of wealthy, powerful people worked out that they could simply force people off the land and take control of it, and that was known as the enclosure movement. And I'm sure Jason will know a great deal about that. We'll probably talk about that more later. And then there was all sorts of business activity that was criminal or unethical, and we've talked a bit about that in an earlier session. So we need to question where this wealth that's being inherited came from in the first place. And if you look at a company like in America, Walmart, it's owned by a family dynasty, the Walton family. They're one of the richest families in the world. They are notorious for having incredibly exploitative employment practices in many of their stores in America. So inheritance is the most obvious free lunch. And that applies to approximately a third of people who are incredibly wealthy. It varies from country to country, and it varies over time. So inheritance used to be by far the most important thing, and it decreased a bit later on in the 20th century. Now it's rising again. So the next area of free lunch is called, I'll use a slightly technical term, but it doesn't mean anything technical. It's called asset price inflation. This simply means if you own land or property or lots of shares in the stock market, they go up and up in value fairly steadily. They fluctuate every now and again, but the trend tends to be upwards quite a lot, and people get wealthier without doing anything. Now, even Winston Churchill famously wrote about this many years ago, saying landowners just have to sit by and do nothing, whilst the value of the land goes up because of the activities of other people and governments in building schools, hospitals, railway networks all around that land. The same is true with stock market investments. If you invest in stock markets at the right time, you can make vast amounts of profit over many years. And some people noted that after the 2008 financial crisis, which led to austerity in many countries, particularly in Britain, and it led to a lot of families and people struggling, the 1,000 richest people doubled their wealth in the following 5 years. And this was partly because of the way governments did basically printing money, but they called it quantitative easing, but it's the same as creating money out of thin air. And that ended up going into the pockets of the wealthiest people primarily. And other people have noticed recently that many of the tech companies have been getting fantastically richer during the coronavirus crisis. Their share prices are going through the roof. Many industries that we've talked about in the past become incredibly successful for two main reasons, and that is industries that get a great deal of government support, or industries that dominate businesses that dominate their industry. So monopoly or oligopoly, to use the technical term. It means they can manipulate prices. So what we see is all around the world, we see the instant billionaires, and that comes from people taking control of industries which are getting support from government, or they dominate their industry. I keep saying industries when I'm in businesses that dominate their industry. And it's just a license to print money, basically. And we've seen over the years that the United States government particularly invests huge amounts of money in tech research, and the likes of Microsoft and Google and so on become incredibly successful businesses off the back of the government research initiating the process. There's another area of industry which is worth looking at, particularly where people get rich, and that is finance. So finance is just the ability to control the money system. And if you look at what happened during the 2008 financial crisis, and we will talk about this in much more detail in a future week, you start to realize that much of the financial system is essentially a global network of interconnected frauds. And people who work in finance, that's senior executives and also the shareholders who own the companies, they can pay themselves more and more and more. And we're seeing pretty much unlimited executive pay. So in fact, I was reading something just the other day, which was saying back in the 1980s, the average executive, this is the chief executive, would be paid 9 or 10 times the average earnings of people. Now, if you look at American companies, executives are paid 400 times as much as the average employee. Now, this has nothing to do with the brilliance of our executives. This is simply about the ability to manipulate the system. And one group of executives will sit on the remuneration committee of another group of executives, and each will just vote for massive pay rises for all of their colleagues. And so we've seen this steady pattern over the last 40 years where the pay of executives has just gone through the roof. And there doesn't appear to be any limit where they will become embarrassed about how much they earn. So this process seems likely to continue. Now, there's an interesting saying in Russia, excuse me, never ask a rich man how he made his first million. And in fact, one of the ways in which people become very rich is outright crime. And you can look at drugs, you can look at money laundering, you can look at all sorts of frauds. And there's a great deal of different types of crime that very powerful people are able to get away with. And in fact, one of the most obvious ones that is never sort of listed as a crime, but once in a blue moon makes it into the press, is when executives basically destroy the pension fund of a company in order to raid it. They just steal the money from the pension fund essentially, and they get very much richer from it. And the laws that we have, certainly if they exist at all to stop this, they're not really applied in a meaningful way. So if we look specifically at the entrepreneurs, the small number of entrepreneurs that have made a great deal of money, the question is, do they deserve their wealth? Well, what people forget is that there is no such thing as a self-made person. All businesses are a joint activity. And any kind of idea or innovation that a person or a company comes up with is simply the top stone on a gigantic pyramid of knowledge that goes back hundreds of years to the development of mathematics, and more recently to the development of computers and microprocessors and other technological achievements. And if somebody comes along with the right idea at the right time that puts an extra stone on this giant pyramid of knowledge, then because of the way the economic and corporate system works, they're able to extract a great deal of wealth from society and to concentrate it into their pockets. And so people forget that we have this enormous infrastructure of education systems to provide a massive network of well-taught young people who will be the next generation of employees in any company. We have legal systems, we have massive networks of suppliers and distributors to help any new business, that no individual is a self-made person. It's incredibly important to remember this. And so these people are being given excessive rewards for what is really a very small contribution. And so let's say you take take Google, for example. At the time Google came up with their search engine, there were lots of other search engines that were coming along at the same time. It's slightly random to some extent which one becomes the dominant system. So Facebook is dominant, but actually a lot of people thought that MySpace would have become the dominant one a decade or two ago. And so there is an element of luck and connections and support from government. So Google has a massive amount of support but from the US government. And all of this is ignored at the moment when people talk about great wealth. And in fact, there's been a great case study on Bill Gates, because he's often held up as a person who really deserves his wealth. Well, in fact, he went to a private school which had computers and a computer club a long time before anybody else really knew what they were at all. And then his mother had connections with people at IBM. So he ended up getting this great contract at IBM, which was what set his company up for the future. When at the time, many experts in IT thought that actually what he was writing, his operating system, was actually second rate. There were many other people writing better operating systems, but they didn't have the same political connections. So you start to realize that luck and political connections really make a massive amount of difference in how these entrepreneurs get rich. Okay, so that's a brief summary, which gives an indication of how great wealth is achieved by manipulation, luck, and so on. Now, for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the harms this does to society. Now, in fact, various people have been starting to write about this in the last few years in great detail, and it's worth, if you're interested at all, it's worth trying to dig out some of the books. There's one in particular called The Spirit Level, which was written a few years ago, which gives a great deal of detail about the harms this does to society in general. But I'm going to focus on 3 points that are kind of obvious once people understand what they are. So the first is the effect this has on the housing market. So in the past, house prices tended to be approximately 4 times average earnings. Now, in many parts of, say, London, other parts of the United Kingdom, and in many other major cities overseas, they're over 10 times average earnings. And this is partly because the prices are driven by the buying power of a global international set of millionaires and billionaires. Well, the rise in house prices has huge negative consequences for other people. So a lot of people in London are now spending half of their income on rent or mortgages. And this increase in house prices is a direct transfer of wealth, actually, from the poor to the rich. If you own a house and it goes up in value, you feel wealthier. If you own a lot of houses or great big houses worth millions and they go up in value, you are much richer. If you cannot afford a house in the first place, the increased house prices makes it harder for you to buy one in the first place, or it means that you just pay a lot more in your rents. So it is a transfer of wealth from poor to rich. The government every now and again will talk about affordable housing, but the word affordable is actually a piece of propaganda, because the price of these homes is actually linked to what they call the market price, which is the price driven up and up and up by these rich people. So in fact, these houses are not affordable at all. They're still far too expensive. And we see whole areas that where you have the global rich buying the properties as investments, they leave them empty, and poorer people are essentially socially cleansed from the areas. So ordinary people then live further and further out, and if they want to work in that area, they have to commute further. So you've got more time, more energy, more costs, more congestion. People are spending more on transport, so they have a lower standard of living. You have more stress, less time with your family, and so on. So you've got all of these knock-on consequences for the rest of society if you have a handful of rich people dominating the price of property in certain parts, say, of London. You get these empty homes, deserts of wealth, but you also get rich people jet setting from city to city, and you realize their carbon emissions and their pollution are off the charts compared to any normal person. And in fact, this has been documented in great detail in a case study in Silicon Valley, which is where the sort of global tech billionaires tend to live. And so what you find is that ordinary people can't afford the homes. So you might have half a dozen people sharing a room, people living in trailers and shelters. You find large numbers of students who are homeless, and so on. So in fact, this is now becoming a global problem in many of the major cities around the world. And that's just for individuals. If you look at what happens when land rents go up in general, it also has knock-on consequences for businesses. The councils will tend to sell hospitals in the city centre and try to build one further out. That becomes very inconvenient for many patients. You notice that business rents will go up. Well, they can be afforded by the international businesses of McDonald's and Pizza Hut, but it becomes more and more difficult for small local businesses to be able to afford the rents. So you end up with more and more what we call clone towns, which are very, very similar to each other. And one of the knock-on consequences of clone towns is because so many of the businesses are American, is that many of the profits go overseas and they're not reinvested into the community. So small and local businesses are basically priced out, and all of these additional costs are passed on to the customers. So everything becomes more expensive for all of us to buy things in these areas. So, excuse me, that's the sort of housing price thing, but I'm going to expand it a little bit and say that the system that creates excessive wealth also causes poverty. So if you have an economy that's growing and growing and growing really rapidly, then you can have situations where people get wealthy without taking wealth off anyone else, just by investing in new technologies and so on. But when societies are not growing rapidly, then when some people become rich, that money is coming out of the pockets of everyone else. It's what some people would call a zero-sum game. So the wealth of the billionaires is coming out of our pockets. It's that they can rip us off as employees, so they can fire and rehire us, or they can put us on 0 hours contracts. They can rip us off as customers. They can rip off their suppliers, and so on. So the flip side of the system creating great wealth is that the rest of society is getting poorer. And individual people who might be on, say, a 0 hours contract, their lives become much harder. They can't get a loan, they can't get a rental contract, they end up going to payday lenders and paying huge interest rates, and so on. So their lives just get harder in every way. And so you start to see, if you look at Jeff Bezos, who's probably the richest man in the world at the moment, estimated worth probably close to $200 billion, although I suspect that changes by the day. So he said of Amazon, he is notorious for exploiting garment workers in Bangladesh and a whole long list of other exploitative mechanisms for helping himself become much wealthier. So a lot of people who support this system talk about trickle down, where the theory is that the wealth of the rich trickles down to the rest of us. But in fact, there's no real evidence of that. What we're seeing is inequality is worse than it's been for close to a century in many advanced nations. We're seeing huge numbers of people at food banks. And in many ways, life in Britain is starting to look a bit like life in developing countries. Excuse me. So the people who wrote The Spirit Level suggested that if you have more equal societies, you have better outcomes in almost every way. People are healthier, people are happier, and so on. That in fact, there is a huge range of additional factors where once you have really unequal societies, you actually have very unhealthy societies in many ways. Okay, so that's the sort of obvious things, the obvious problems with excessive wealth. I'm going to talk about how they distort politics and how they distort the news as the two final things I'm going to talk about. So if we look at politics, very many people throughout history have noted that extreme wealth corrupts people. So wealthy individuals will lobby governments for policies that benefit them. But those policies at the same time will often harm society. They want taxes to be cut for the rich, and they want regulations to be cut for the rich, and they want existing industries privatized. But in doing this, they will often destroy the environment. The cuts in regulations will enable them to exploit their workforce. The tax cuts for the rich will mean that if a government wants to spend the same amount of money as it did before, it will have to take the taxes from somewhere else. And so other people will be taxed more. So we have to understand that wealthy people have the ear of politicians all the time. They help to fund them. And we've talked about that in the past, how corrupt politics has become. But wealthy people don't care about unemployment or food banks or homelessness. So we end up with politicians who really aren't dealing with the real problems of our societies. In fact, they're making those problems worse. And so we're seeing that more and more politicians are being funded who basically share the views of the rich. And we've got what I would call, the word has slipped, it'll come back in a minute. It's government by the 1% for the 1%. Everything about politics becomes distorted. And this is even happening overseas, where Bill Gates sets up foundations and they offer, let's say, medicines to some countries. But at the same time, he's actually lobbying to reinforce medical patents. And he ends up distorting politics overseas. He puts pressure on governments to do things in a certain way. And then the final area that I want to mention is how the rich distort the news. So firstly, they distort it obviously by owning the private newspapers. They own the vast majority of the private newspapers. So you see someone like Rupert Murdoch, a billionaire, controls a great many newspapers and other media outlets in many countries. But there's a broader thing, that even a newspaper that's not necessarily owned by the wealthy tends to see the world in a way that reflects the views of the wealthy. So we define success by how wealthy we are. We present wealth as something that we all should be striving for, and we should be envious of these people with great wealth. And so you see all of these TV programs about homes of the rich and famous and so on. So we end up with a situation where we have what I've talked about earlier in presentations about propaganda, where we talk about censorship by omission, where really important questions are not asked. So in fact, I've never seen a discussion in the mainstream media where anyone ever discusses the downsides of extreme wealth or the downsides of billionaires. It's just recently begun to be discussed
Mhm.
in America, as I mentioned at the beginning, but I've never seen it discussed in the UK. But it also has a strange way of distorting how we think about things. So it reinforces a belief in individual talent, and the media will present these rich people. If you look at the sort of the Forbes richest 1,000 people in the world, they'll say, you know, these people are hardworking, they're brilliant entrepreneurs, they're clever, and so on. They won't talk about all the things that we've just discussed about how the system is rigged to help them exploit others, and so on. And wealth and power in the hands of a few people is presented as natural or inevitable, in the same way that the media love the royal family. They take it for granted that it's okay to have this massive inheritance of wealth and this situation of prestige and power and so on. There is no criticism of this whole system. So I had a few suggestions about what to do, and it's only very kind of general things. It's not specific things. But the first thing to do is don't drop out of politics because you think the politicians don't represent us. We will only ever bring about change if we all get involved actively in politics. Stop watching the mainstream news and current affairs and reading mainstream newspapers. Their aim is to distract attention from the true source of many problems. And so you'll never really know what the true source of many problems is if you only get your information from them. So go and look for good information on the internet. Now, interestingly enough, there are one or two organizations in America that are starting to use the phrase plutocracy prevention program. Plutocracy was the word I was trying to think of earlier when I was talking about government by the rich for the rich. And in order to avoid this concentration of wealth, we have to keep all options on the table. So lots of people will talk about higher taxes, but nobody ever talks about saying, let's have a law that just stops this happening. For some reason, taxes are acceptable, but laws that stop rich people exploiting the rest of us, people don't like to talk about those, but we have to keep all options on the table. So if you look at the policy discussions that are discussed in the mainstream media, they do occasionally talk about the idea of wealth taxes. Occasionally they talk about land taxes or financial transactions taxes, but nobody's really debating this seriously. They're just getting mentioned as an idea, but there is no policy discussion about it, when in fact, we should be looking at those ideas very, very seriously. And we need to promote serious debates about how we go about implementing those things. So the fact that those things, those taxes, are the only options that are ever discussed in the mainstream shows the narrow range of possibilities. Whereas if you start thinking more widely, let's say you look at inheritance, some people have put forward the idea of limiting the total amount that any individual can inherit in their lifetime to a set figure, let's say £100,000. It could even be zero and have no inheritance. And this would completely transform the debate about inheritance. You could do all sorts of things about banning people from owning multiple homes and so on. And this would start to make a difference to the concentrations of power and wealth in our societies. Okay, well, I think that's a nice introduction, Jason, so I shall open it up to discussion.
Fabulous, Rod. Thank you so much. Yet again, so much to discuss and bring together across the piece here. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to start off at the how bit of how individuals, etc., become excessively wealthy, and then we'll move on to the latter part in terms of the consequences. And you kindly introduced me into it in terms of the nature of the Enclosure Act, and of course that was unbelievably significant in terms of carving up common land that rightfully should be owned by all of us. We are only mere tenants, aren't we, for our lifespan, and then that's it for us. It's the next generations, and as they continuously come through, they should be able to utilize that land commonly for the benefit of the commons. But as we saw in the Middle Ages and around that time, that it was all carved up for a very, very small elite group of people to then dominate in the way in which they wanted it to be dominated. And it's interesting just bringing in a point here, because many people who are political commentators have, Peter Hitchens being a classic example, but many, many more on the right are now arguing that the Conservative Party is no longer about conservation, about conserving. And the book's been ripped up. It's now about getting wealthy quickly, exploitation, and effectively just being stooges of the big corporations. So what you would expect is an understanding by the Conservative Party, if it actually was a Conservative Party, is to conserve the past, to make change very, very slow. But of course, the major problem is here, Rod, is that at what point do we stop? Because if we're about conserving the country in which we live in pre-enclosure acts, then we're talking about an egalitarian, a much more egalitarian experience. But of course, they aren't. They're talking about conserving it post-enclosure acts, when a small elite group have taken control pretty much of everywhere and everything. So that's a real discussion to be had, because what they're talking about, as I say, is conservatism post-enclosure act, which is why the enclosure acts are so vital to any discussion about wealth.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. And the strange thing is, I'm aware for myself that until actually quite recently, I realized I knew nothing about this kind of earlier historical part of the creation of inequality through the Enclosure Act and other sort of mechanisms. And I've realized that it's really, like many of the things we discuss, they're simply not taught properly in schools. And a few people probably do study them at university. But the problem with the way a lot of history is taught at universities is that it's kind of taught as if it was then, and nobody really relates it very much to now. Absolutely. But as you're saying, actually, it's fundamental to make this link. And I think, sadly, we've got to a position, and it's been this way for a while now, where both political parties really are very much interested in maintaining the status quo. And I think it's always been the case that the British establishment behind the scenes has wanted to conserve the status quo, and has done whatever it can to sort of block any serious changes and to limit the debate about what changes might take place. But this does unfortunately mean that the vast majority of ordinary people who get their information from the news, they're very limited in what possibilities they are prepared to consider, and how far away from the existing system they think it's acceptable to go. And I think partly there's a sort of a fear of change that people are afraid of. But I do think it is quite interesting that I often sort of hark back to this short 20-year period after World War II, where again the measures were sort of taxes, but the taxes were so high it made a difference, that it did lower inequality and create a more equal society, far more equal than we'd ever had at any point. And it didn't last very long, unfortunately, and it was easily reversed. And it would have been nice if they found ways to put changes in place that could have stuck for longer. But I think the possibilities, if we actually open the discussion up and say to everybody, listen, what do you think we could do if we start with essentially a clean slate in terms of the rules and regulations about lobbying, about revolving doors between companies and governments, about the influence of rich people over governments? Can we find ways to completely block super rich people from having influence over government and forcing governments to serve the 99% and things like this? Then I think all sorts of possibilities open up.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, when you say that, people fear change, I don't think the problem so much is change. If you look at the last 30, 40 years, people have had to get used to change. But the change that they've had to get used to is the change that's been imposed. It's not the change where we are asked to inherently become part of the force for change.
I agree.
We are told what that change is going to be, and we have to like it or lump it. So within the workplace, for example, within the education system, we have no say. We might think we have. We might be given lip service that we have, but we effectively do not have that capacity. So in the end, we're just conditioned and taught to get on the roller coaster and to just hang on for dear life and to see where it takes us and hope that we don't fall off, because we're not physically being asked to come together and make the world a better place. We're being told that this is the world as it is. Just live it.
Yes, I think that you used an interesting phrase there. This is the world as it is. I remember when I was younger, kind of looking around, thinking this is the world, and sort of subconsciously thinking to myself, and this is the way it's always been. But of course, that's not true. What you realize as you get older is that there's continuous change going on, but it's all driven by a handful of people behind the scenes.
Yes.
And if we understand that the world is in continuous change, but we need to be part of the conversation that drives the change, then we can have a completely different world. But we need to get everybody saying, yes, I want to be part of that discussion.
Yes, and the more you condition people to be disempowered, the less able they are to be empowered. Mm-hmm. And of course, the less likely they are to demand participatory democracy and just accept the representative processes that have been imposed on us over time. Interesting, you mentioned the Russian oligarchs, and not to ask the question how they made their first million, because we only have to look at, for example, the owner of Chelsea Football Club. And it's interesting how the corporate media haven't really ever gone close to how he made his money. And yet those investigations that have taken place have revealed a lot of dark facts, but the corporate media simply won't go there. So we have to ask the question, why? Why are none of the sports journalists, for example, ever allowed to really go into that shadow, so we say? You mentioned about Google, and I'm just wondering, in terms of a search engine, whether it's all the factors that you identify, but whether it's also that sort of laissez-fairness of Google. They're not, for example, saying that or every penny that we make or every click that we get will plant a tree and become an environmental model or whatever. They're very much this is Google, and we're going to get richer and richer and richer and richer. We're pretty proud of what we're doing, and therefore the rich and powerful from the outside have said, yeah, Google's the way forward. So it might also be the economic and political ideology, so we say, of Google that is attractive really to those people, as it is we are maybe more attracted to environmental search engines.
Well, I think it's interesting. Whenever I start to research any of these things, I realize there's so much more kind of that's never discussed going on behind the scenes. And whilst I haven't looked in great detail at the sort of different search engines in relation to their environmental credentials, one of the things that comes out with Google is that the technology that drives Google search engines is the same technology that enables the American spy agency, the NSA, to go through trillions of data records. And in fact, Google got funding from the US government to help develop its algorithms. And there was some very interesting information came out a few years ago, because Julian Assange wrote a book called When Google Met WikiLeaks. So when Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy, senior people from Google went to visit him, and they talked about a number of things. And they left a business card. And some months later, he tried to phone them, and it turned out he was getting through to Hillary Clinton's office. And you start to realize there is this immensely powerful connection between the biggest businesses, particularly in America, and the American government. They are not separate kind of entrepreneurial things. This is an extension of government policy. And all the data that Google takes on board, it's profitable to Google because it can sell it to advertisers and so on, but it's also useful to the US government because that way the US government can analyze what everyone is doing and so on.
Yeah. That was extremely frightening. And of course, you mentioned Hillary Clinton. And if you look at the talk shows and the corporate media in this country, they constantly, invite her and Chelsea to talk. So they're legitimating their voice.
All the time, absolutely. I agree.
And the people who don't study politics in any great detail or have critical thinking skills, it's just reinforcing the fact that Hillary Clinton is a good egg, even though when you take off the shell, it's rotting right through to the yolk. But you know what I'm saying. So it's celebrating something that's puerile, something that's very extremely damaging, but giving this veneer that actually it's good, it's cool.
Absolutely. It absolutely sickens me the way the mainstream media, and this is Britain and America and many other countries too, and they do this kind of I use the term arse licking of all of these really criminal people. And it makes it so obvious once you understand the crimes of these people, just how awful the media is.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You talked about moving on now to the effects and the consequences. And you talked about one of the ways in which very rich people can invest that isn't damaging to society. And you used the example, new tech. However, I would argue that actually the long-term consequences of these people investing in new tech means that the reliance upon human labor declines, and therefore more and more people are finding themselves out of work. But it also has a dramatic effect on precious metals that are constantly being mined, and therefore the supply becomes much more limited while the demand stays the same or increases. So that in itself has huge consequences for the environment, for climate change, and much more generically across society in relation to how those particular precious metals could be used for really, really important things, as opposed to the mundane idea that we should all have multiple computers and devices within our homes, for example.
So I think that's a really good point, and it's actually a really sort of fundamental question at the heart of what it is that we want as the society in terms of how we live our lives. So let's say you go back to the era where people first started making cars and they developed production lines and so on. And so they came up with these kind of technological leaps. So it's the internal combustion engine and so on. And they started making cars, and now we have billions of cars. So would we have been better off if we'd never developed cars? Interestingly enough, I was in the Transport Museum the other day, and there's a quote by Churchill saying that the transition from horse-drawn stuff to cars was one of the worst mistakes humans ever made, which I find a very interesting sort of quote. So most people would say, well, I think probably we want cars. It's enabled us to travel more than a few miles very easily and so on, and all this sort of thing. But it has massive downsides, as you correctly identify, in terms of pollution, resource depletion, and so on. And so it's this kind of fundamental debate about whether we want economic growth very much or not. And I'm always fascinated, actually. I was in the state of India called Kerala some years ago. So my wife is from India, and we were on a lake, and there were lots of these people in small boats diving into the lake. And I thought initially they were fishing, but somebody explained to me, actually, the lake is very shallow, and they were going down and they were scooping clay off the bottom of the lake that can be used in the building industry. And so my first sort of thought as somebody from the West is, well, why don't they all get together and buy one machine that gets more clay than they can kind of get in a year off the bottom of the bed in a few days, and then if there's 100 of them, one of them can operate the machine, 99 of them can either relax or do something completely different, and and have technological progress and so on. And of course, there's this question mark that says, well, maybe they actually like doing what they do. Maybe they don't mind, not having the machinery and not having not everyone having a car and so on. And there is this fundamental question about what sort of a society ultimately we want to live on, and what lifestyles we want to lead.
Yeah, and also it not you, Rod, but it leads us in the West to become very patronizing and condescending. And what we then do is we impose our hegemony upon them. So, if you think about divers who used to go pearl fishing, that to be able to hold your breath for that length of time, to train yourself from a child, be taught by your father or your mother, and then we're coming along and saying we don't need to do that. Just get into a diving bell, go down, whatever. I'm just using that as an example, of course. Shovel it all up, bring it back to the surface, and then what happens? They don't have ownership of the pearls. Some corporation has the ownership of the pearls. It's the people who are just doing the meaningless jobs. And also, you talk about India, but it's interesting that the pharmaceutical industry rely upon many people across the Indian subcontinent to dig holes in paddy fields, for example, and put their hands in and get cobras, then to be able to extract the venom from the cobras, which are then being used by the pharmaceutical industry in anesthetics and many other facets of obviously anti-venoms. But 70 to 80,000 Indians a year die across the subcontinent as a direct result.
Oh, so your knowledge of the cobra system is way beyond mine. I haven't come across this before, so I have no doubt that you're right. So absolutely, it is Western companies exploiting people all over the world, and it's a terrible system. And we're going to be talking about that more and more in future weeks about the international economic system.
Yeah, talking about obviously the role of politics. We've talked about this before, and we're going to talk about it a lot in the future, but effectively many of our politicians now are effectively just stooges.
I agree completely. It's hard to see very many independently minded politicians at all in either party. And I think that's a real shame for our politics. And you can see the same in America, usually slightly worse, that in America, probably at any moment in time, you could count on one hand how many politicians there might be who would really challenge all the vested interests.
Yeah.
And I think Britain is unfortunately heading that way, and it's getting worse. And I think there's a deliberate move by the establishment in Britain to make it harder and harder for people who have critical views. So the obvious person would be Jeremy Corbyn, making it harder and harder for people like him to get heard and to have a meaningful political debate. So they've basically destroyed what in the past might have been a functioning democracy. It no longer is. And I think it's going to be quite an uphill struggle to turn it back into anything that does resemble a functioning democracy.
Yes, absolutely. And whereas talk about Jeremy Corbyn, it gave a lot of people this hope, false hope as it turned out, but it gave them hope that actually we could have a much more decent, progressive, empowered society. But of course, from the establishment's point of view, they saw it in a completely different way. They saw him entirely as a major threat, that they need to bring out all the battalions in order to make sure that he didn't ever succeed, and that many of his supporters could then be picked off one by one over time and rendered irrelevant. It's up to us, of course, and this leads us on to the media. It's up to us, as you rightly said, to avoid as much as possible the corporate media, corporate news, to go to independent so that they grow and become a competitive threat, if you like, and hopefully in the future take over from the corporate media, in order for us to really understand what people like Jeremy Corbyn were about and why the establishment believed that he was and his supporters were such a threat. Yeah,
so it's an uphill struggle, isn't it? So I think the politics and stuff we've talked about before.
Yes,
and it's one of those things that solutions will not be forthcoming within a 2 or 3 minute discussion. It really does require us to come up with a complete rethink of the structure of our grassroots systems in the UK.
And I think the final point is inheritance. We've done a 10 by 6 before in terms of inheritance, and I think it came from Daniel Craig, who argued that, you know, he'd now obviously made a lot of money, but he wasn't doing everything possible to ensure that most of that money wasn't passed on to his children, because he just didn't believe it was any way positive for them to rely upon the income that he'd made, and that they needed to find their own way. But one of the major issues I think that comes out when we talk about inheritance, and you talked about possibly limiting it to £100,000, is where does the rest go? Is it down to the individual to say, okay, I want it to go to the Cats Protection League, I want it to go to the RSPCA, etc., etc., or is it handed over to the state, who then make those decisions on our behalf? Because I think the former is a lot more attractive than the latter for many, many people.
Yeah, well, that's a debate that we must have. You know, we must get other people involved in participating in that debate. One of the things that always interests me is that whenever I kind of ask for people's opinions on various things, which are things that I'm not teaching, but it kind of extends beyond that, then I realize that my views are not necessarily the same as the average person in the UK, and that anything that I might put forward as a solution may not be anything like what would be the most popular solution if it were really discussed by a wide number of people. So that's a debate that we really must have. You know, how should we decide how that wealth is distributed? So there's layers and layers of sort of steps to that, because ideally that wealth would never be concentrated in the hands of one person in the first place. So we have to work out how to stop that wealth being concentrated in one person's hands. But then for the existing wealth, we have to work out how to eliminate it as a concentration of wealth. And so you can do it in one generation. If you say it cannot be passed on in a gigantic block to any individual or group of people, and it has to be dispersed. But the best way to disperse it is an open question. And of course, there's complexities to implementing these ideas, in that the rich will tend to have very, very sophisticated financial advisors and lawyers who will try to come up with all sorts of complex international legal structures to try to stop us doing this. And so it's quite a challenge. But I think all of this is surmountable if we really put our heads together and decide that is what we want to do.
That's a brilliant place to finish, Rod. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And, you know, for those people who are watching the program, you know, please subscribe to the channel, find out a lot more what, you know, Rod has had to say in his interviews and sessions, and many, many more to come. But thank you, Rod, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you again next week. Cheerio.